In this lecture, we are going to discuss about another solved problem on process synchronization, and this problem is from GATE 2019 CS paper. Alright, so let's see what is the question. Consider three concurrent processes P1, P2 and P3 as shown below, which access a shared variable d that has been initialized to 100. So we have three processes P1, P2 and P3, and they are accessing this shared variable d. So this variable d is shared between P1, P2 and P3. That means all of P1, P2 and P3 can read from d, they can update the value of d. So the initial value of d is set to 100. Now what does P1 do? P1 sets d equal to d plus 20. So it adds 20 to the current value of d. And P2 subtracts 50 from the value of d. And what P3 does is it will add 10 to the value of d. So these are what the three processes P1, P2 and P3 are capable of doing. So now let's see what is the question. So the question says, the processes are executed on a uniprocessor system running a time-shared operating system. If the minimum and maximum possible values of d after the three processes have completed execution are x and y respectively, then the value of y minus x blank. So here it says that these processes are executed on a uniprocessor system. That means it is a system in which only one process can run at a time, and it is running a time-shared operating system. That means each process will be given a particular amount of time to execute, after which it will be preempted, and then the next process will be given the chance. So there will be a time slice for each of the processes to carry out their executions. So it says here, if the minimum and maximum possible values of d after the three processes have completed execution are x and y respectively, then what is the value of y minus x? So here we need to consider what are the maximum and minimum values of d that is possible. If the processes P1, P2 and P3 all completes execution in some order, which we don't know, which we have to figure out, we have to find out what is the minimum possible value of d that can be there and what is the maximum possible value of d that can be there. So we have to find out some particular order. If these processes are executed, what is the minimum possible value of d and the maximum possible value of d. So here we are considering that x is the minimum possible value and y is the maximum possible value. What is the value of y minus x? That means what is the difference between the maximum value and the minimum value? So we have three options: 80, 130, 50 or none of these. So let us see how we can solve this. First of all, there are many orders in which they can execute. So we have to figure out the order in which it will give the maximum value and the order in which they can give the minimum value of d. And keep in mind that the operations that can be performed by these processes P1, P2 and P3 are the read operation. It can read the value of d and it can calculate the value of d. So there are calculations that we see here. P1 is doing this, P2 is doing this and P3 is doing this. And then they can update the value of d. So these are the three operations that can be performed: read, calculate and update. We see that the initial value of d is set to 100. So that is given in the question. It is initialized to 100. We have processes P1, P2 and P3. So we need to figure out if this processes executes in some order, what is the maximum and minimum values that we can have. So first of all, let's try to find out the minimum value. Let's start with process P2 because P2 is doing the subtract operation. So let's assume that if we go in this order, we can get the minimum value. So what is the first value of d that we have? It is 100. So let's say that P2 is now going to begin its execution. So what P2 will do first, it will read the value of d. What is the value of d? The first value of d is equal to 100. So P2 just read the value of d. Now before it calculates, let's say that the time is over and it got preempted. And once it gets preempted, now let's say P1 is the next one who gets the chance. So P1, when it will read, it will see that the value of d is also equal to 100 because d was only read by P2 and it did not modify anything. So the value of d still remains as 100. Now what will P1 do? Let's say that it is also allowed to calculate an update. P1 will set the value of d equal to d plus 20. So it will add 20 to it and hence what will it give? It will give the value 120. So the value of d becomes 120 now. Now let's say that P3 gets the chance. Now when P3 will read, what is the value of d that it will see? This is the latest value of d that is there. According to P3, the value of d is 120 and what will it do? It will add 10 to it. let's say that it is allowed to do the calculation and the updation also. So the value becomes 130. So P1 has completed read, calculate and update. P3 also has completed read, calculate and update. But what about P2? P2 just read the value of D, and before it calculated and updated, it was preempted. So what will happen here? It is still thinking that the value of D is equal to 100. So according to P2, the value of D is still 100. We know that the final value here we have is now 130. But P2, when it has read, at that time the value was 100. So if it is not reading again, it is still having that value as 100. So now it will do the calculation. So what is the calculation? D minus 50. So it will subtract 50 from here. And what is the value that it will have? The value is 50. This is the value that is given by P2. So if we execute in this order and if we see that P2 gets preempted in that way, then the minimum possible value that we can have is 50. So 50 is the minimum value that we have for D. So we have found the minimum value, which is X. Now we have to find the maximum value. So again, let's say that we have these processes P1, P2 and P3. So in this case, we have to find the maximum value. So let's say that we are starting from P1. So we see that P1 is the one that adds the most value to D. So that is why we'll start from P1. It is not always the case, but let's just assume that that is going to be the case, and let's just start from P1. So P1 will first read. So what is the value of D? The value of D is 100. And then before P1 could calculate an update, let's say that it gets preempted. So it gets preempted and the control goes to P2, let's say. So for P2, the value of D is still equal to 100. And let's say that P2 is allowed to read, calculate and update. So what does P2 do? It is subtracting 50 from it. So it subtracts 50 from it and then it makes the value equal to 50. Okay. So this is the value that we have for D that is updated by P2. Now let's say that P1 gets back the control again here. So if P1 gets back the control here again, then what will happen? According to P1, D is equal to 100. It already read the value of D equal to 100, but it did not calculate an update. So it will not read again. It is just going to calculate an update. So what does P1 do? P1 adds 20 to the value of D. So plus 20, which makes it 120. So it updates the value. Now P3 gets the chance. So according to P3, when it will try to read, what will it read? It will read the final value, which is 120. So that is the latest value. And what does it do? It will add 10 to it. So it adds 10 to it, giving the value 130. This is the final value of D that we have here. And we see this is the maximum value that we can get. So you may be thinking, why did we make some of the process preempt after reading and not allow it to calculate and update? Only if we do in that way, we are able to get the maximum value. So you have to check like this, in which way are we able to get the maximum values of D? This 130 is the maximum value that we can get and the minimum value is 50. So we got the values of X and Y. So X is equal to 50, which is the minimum value, and Y is equal to 130, that is the maximum value. Okay, so now we have the values of X and Y, and our question was to find out what is Y minus X. So what is Y minus X? 130 minus 50, which is equal to 80. This is our answer. And do we have it in the question? Yes, option A is 80. So this is the difference between the maximum and the minimum values that we can have for the value of D if these processes P1, P2 and P3 are executed. So in this way, you have to figure out what is the maximum and minimum values that we can get if the processes are preempted in some order. Alright, so that is how you will be solving this question. So I hope this was clear to you. Thank you for watching and see you in the next one.